Good morning. If you are in the Facebook room where we don't know that you're there, we're welcoming you. You may be joining us on Facebook Live as well, or looking at this presentation at a later time. So we welcome you and glad that you're here, and all of us who are here in person. Simply because there are not any other people in the room digitally right now, we still are going to use the microphone for people who may be just in the general Facebook page, and or those who might be viewing the class at a later time. We move today towards, in some ways, the ultimate, I guess we could say the penultimate again. It's the penultimate class, but it's also the penultimate part of the gospel according to John. Because we're going to be ending what are sometimes called the farewell discourses, but the end of those last chapters where Jesus seems to be teaching at the Last Supper, end in the 17th chapter with a prayer that is the entire 17th chapter. Sometimes this is referred to as Jesus' high priestly prayer. It's a prayer that sort of bridges the gap between Jesus, the historical figure, and the risen Jesus. Because it seems like that it's in some ways the risen Jesus who's saying these prayers, even though in the gospel, temporally speaking, he has not yet come to his death and resurrection. But as always is the case in the Gospel of John, there's this sort of shuttling back and forth between a story about the historical Jesus and layered on top of it, the Jesus of the Christ of faith, the risen Jesus. And as we've said, this is often sort of like one of those, I guess we called them, for lack of a better term, a hologram image where it looks one way, and then you turn it around and it looks like something else, right? This happens again and again in the Gospel of John. Let's see. So what I think we might do with this prayer in chapter 17 is just, instead of dealing with this in the way we sometimes do, sort of expositional understanding of the gospel like we've been doing, I think for this chapter we might do it in a little different way. That is, think about it as a prayer. Enter into the text, and we won't read the entire chapter, but I'm going to read chunks of it. As we go through it, I'm going to pause it after different chunks, and if anything touches your heart and mind, you're welcome to share that. But again, remembering to ask for the microphone as we speak. So let's allow ourselves to be conscious of the presence of God here, to be conscious of the presence of the risen Jesus who is praying this prayer, both on the night before he died and in his risen presence with us here today. Jesus spoke these words, starting at verse 6. I have made your name known to those whom you gave me from the world. They were yours, and you gave them to me, and they have kept your word. Now they know that everything you have given me is from you. For the words that you gave me, I have given to them, and they have received them, and know in truth that I came from you, and they have believed that you sent me. I am asking on their behalf. I am not asking on behalf of the world, but on behalf of those to whom you have given me, because they are yours. All mine are yours, and yours are mine, and I have been glorified in them. And now I am no longer in the world, but they are in the world, and I am coming to you. Holy Father, protect them in your name that you have given me, so that they may be one, as we are one. And then a little later in verse 14, I have given them your word, and the world has hated them because they do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. I'm not asking that you take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. They do not belong to the world, just as I do not belong to the world. Sanctify them in the truth. Your word is true. As you have sent me into the world, so I have sent them into the world. And for their sakes I sanctify myself, so that they also may be sanctified in truth. So let's pause there for a moment. And it's okay to have silence for a bit. And if anyone wants to share anything, just let me know and I'll hand the microphone.
Well, I noticed that this prayer seems to be for the followers and the church, the present, the church, and he's not really praying for the whole world or the.
So, right. So he's praying for his followers at this point, right? And he's sending them out into the world, right? So that he gives them strength for their mission. Yeah.
I find it interesting that he said, I am no longer in the world. That in spirit, he was already transitioning.
Is this prayer in any other gospels?
No, this is the only place it happens. And now in the other gospels, we find out that Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane. He goes off by himself and prays, but we don't have, we find out that he says, let this cup pass for me. But we don't know what else he prays. But John gives us this prayer. And again, the other element might be, I am no longer in the world, might be the risen Jesus too, as well as, again, that's like back and forth, right? Who's speaking here, right?
Or the glorified Christ.
Yeah, the glorified Christ, the one who is already risen and speaking through the community, right? Anyone else at this point?
Hello. Okay. My question is, in the prayer, he says that that we're no longer welcome by the world. What exactly was it that catalyzed that thing or whatever?
It's actually good timing because I was commenting on I'm not asking you to take them out of the world, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. I thought that was really powerful, and this idea that being a follower of Christ is not about escaping the evil, it's about having the strength to contend with it.
I think then I would like to comment too, because I had a different take on that line, and it was concerning when it says, but I ask you to protect them from the evil one. And of course, what sprang into my mind were how many of them then were martyred. And I often ask myself, would I have had the courage to be in that group if I saw this happening it's quite a challenge, but that's where you need the faith.
That goes back to the verse today from Luke's gospel, fear not, little flock, right? And it's a similar idea, right? That he doesn't take us out of the world, but is with us. It doesn't mean that we'll be shielded from all the problems of life, right? I mean, that's not what he's saying either. But he said, I'll be with you, right, in the midst of all of that. And I think your question about the world versus the followers of Jesus, is that where you were going with that? Like, yeah, that throughout this gospel, Jesus is calling a little community of folks to believe in him, and that they go out into the world then to continue his mission. And the world refers to the cosmos, refers to, on the one hand, that world that God lovingly created and made in all of its beauty and all the people in it and even human society, which we have a desire to be in society and community with each other, but that world also is sort of distorted. It's warped. It's sort of like not right side up. And the purpose of the mission of Jesus is to restore the world, to make it right side up again.
When you said that, it made me think of Martin Luther King. I said, when you said that, it made me think of Martin Luther King. He said, I have been to the mountaintop. And in his speech, it was like he knew he wasn't going to see what he was fighting for, and he had let go of the world. It was that same kind of feeling.
And so maybe Jesus has that word too, and that human fear. Maybe, could it be that this is not going to happen, right? But then we know on the cross that he ultimately hands it over to God. I mean, not in John's gospel, but in other gospels, he says, into your hands I commend my spirit. Right? That sort of ultimately he trusts. Roma had some.
Hi, Gloria. We just wanted to welcome you as a group. It all of this kind of reminds me of one of the tensions that I experience in my faith, of the constant kind of back and forth between, the promises of, life in heaven with God versus the life in this world that we've been given, and how both are gifts, and both, you can't spend too much time living for the future of heaven, because you've been given this kind of the gift of life in this world for a reason. Like, you're not, like Jesus says here, he's not asking to take us out of this one. There's a reason we're in this world, but at the same time, not to get too attached to life and earthly goods, because there's an eternity at the end. And I guess that's kind of a tension I'm always feeling between like this world and the next, I guess. And I think this passage really beautifully addresses it.
So let's move to verse 20. I ask not only on behalf of these, but also on behalf of those who believe in me through their word, that they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me, and I am in you. May they also be in us, so that the world may believe that you have sent me. verse 24. Father, I desire that those also whom you have given me may be with me where I am, to see my glory, which you have given me because you loved me before the foundation of the world. Righteous Father, the world does not know you, but I know you, and these know that you have sent me. I made your name known to them, and I will make it known, so that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them. And again, taking just a moment to reflect on those words and anything that jumps out to us.
Well, for so long in Christianity, and of course today, every Christian group kind of looks at the others and says, well, yeah, they're Christians, but they're not quite as good Christians as we are. And there are things that we disagree with, but I sometimes I think I need to think about the fact that at the end we actually are one community, even if we have a lot of theological disagreements.
And in fact, that is Jesus' prayer, right? For all of us to know that at the end of the day, we all swim in that same baptismal water, even though we might have many different beliefs on various things, right? What always strikes me, by the way, while I have the mic, is that Jesus prays for us in this prayer, right? That through the pages of the scripture and throughout history, Jesus, who is both risen and there before his death, prays for all of us who will be the ones who have received the word and the mission of Jesus throughout time. That always strikes me about this passage.
What strikes me in this one, and I don't have the King James in front of me, but it says, he's in God, so thou in me and I in them. It's a way of him saying he's with God the Father, we are in Christ, and because he's in God, so that we are all one. And that's what has been a foundational scripture for me. It's that oneness and maintaining that oneness.
And it relates back to what we talked about last week about Jesus' last I am saying, I am the vine, you are the branches, or some philologists are saying that in the time of Jesus, that word was sometimes translated as vineyard. So I am the vineyard and you are the vines. Is it just a different twist on it? It's really the same idea, but it has a different sort of twist if we think of being planted in the ground, right? It has a different sort of twist. Anything else on this end of this prayer? Yeah. Well, some of you who have been around St. John's for a while know that not this past year because we didn't have a meal, but we would read this chapter at the end of the supper on Maundy Thursday before we moved into the stripping of the altar and the going to the altar of repose. It was that transition moment from the more joyful time of our meal together to the time of going to the altar of repose and the stripping of the altar, etc. And we pray that prayer of Jesus as those first disciples were there. And we hear Jesus in our own midst praying that prayer. Perhaps again when there's a meal again someday after I'm gone, but you all will be here. You will hear that again. Now we move into the next section of this gospel, and that is the arrest of Jesus, the trial, crucifixion, and ultimately his burial. And again, I would commend to, I mean, we, as we've said all along, this is sort of a tour through John's gospel, right? So we, like any tour, we are seeing highlights, and we aren't going to stop at every stop along the way, but we're going to look at pieces of it that sometimes even may reveal those patterns that again repeat in the gospel as well. So after Jesus had spoken these words, he went out with his disciples across the Kidron Valley. This is 18 verse 1, to a place where there was a garden, which he and his disciples entered. So think in your mind's eye, the city of Jerusalem, and there's walls around the city with various gates, and Jesus goes down from city of Jerusalem up here, goes down through the Kidron Valley and up again to the small hill called the Mount of Olives, and there's an olive grove there, still exists today, and Jesus would go there with his disciples, and that's why Judas knew about it, right? So he's in this olive garden, not the restaurant, but an olive garden nonetheless. And it's a garden. John wants us to think sometimes. Sometimes he'll make these very brief allusions to things, right? And this is a garden because it's not unlike the first garden, where human beings fell, human beings put their own self in opposition to the plan of God, that there was that serpent, that slithery serpent in the garden that caused humankind to turn towards their own way. And that slithering serpent is here in this garden too, in the person that in the betrayal of Jesus by his beloved friend Judas, and the whole world coming against him. Notice here that there are going, well, we'll get into that. We'll see that there's lots of different folks coming in John's version of the story anyways. Now, Judas, who betrayed him, also knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and weapons. So we can imagine that maybe these were soldiers, Roman soldiers, as well as soldiers from the religious leaders. Then Jesus, knowing what was about to happen to him, came forward and asked them, "Whom are you looking for?" They answered, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus replied, "I am he." And literally in Greek, it is ego ami. So there's no he there. It's Jesus replied, "I am." Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When Jesus said to them, "I am he," they stepped back and fell to the ground. Why would they do that? Because of the divine name being spoken. What's that?
I said, when he said that, I imagined there being like, "I am." That's why they
So yes, right? I mean, so he speaks the divine name, and that in and of itself is so powerful so in other words, all these folks are coming to arrest him. But at the end of the day, he's still in charge in some way, right? That's sort of the interesting take. Jesus is both that hologram again, right? On the one hand, victim, on the one hand, God.
So did we skip over the Last Supper then?
Last Supper was earlier. Last Supper was last week.
Okay,
You missed it, Richard.
sorry.
And what you would have found out is that there is no Eucharist in John's Gospel at the Last Supper. It's only the washing of the feet. At the last, as told in the story. If you go back to John 6, he talks all about the Eucharist in John chapter 6. But at the Last Supper, he doesn't focus on the Eucharist. He focuses on foot washing, doesn't tell us about the institution of the Lord's Supper. John doesn't. The other three do, but John doesn't. No, they left the place and they go to the garden. They have the Last Supper in wherever room they are. They leave the city, go out to this garden place. Maybe that's where they spent the night because it's crowded in Jerusalem during Passover. Easy place to like camp out. But the Last Supper would have been in what's sometimes referred to as the upper room. That there's an upper room that the Last Supper takes place in, and then they leave the city, go out to the garden, and this is where the arrest takes place. Outside of any place where there could be a crowd or anything like that, right? Where they can get him by himself, so that it's easier to arrest him.
That's consistent in the other three Gospels.
There's some distinctions, but it is a similar story, right? So again, he asked them, verse 7, "Whom are you looking for?" And they said, "Jesus of Nazareth." Jesus answered, "I told you that I am. So if you were looking for me, let these people go." This was to fulfill the word that he had spoken. "I did not lose a single one of those whom you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. The slave's name was Malchus. John remembers who the name of the guy was. Jesus said to Peter, "Put your sword back in its sheath. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So Jesus' hour has come, and he is going ahead to do what he is being called to do. And two different times Jesus says, "Whom are you looking for?" Do you remember at the very, very beginning of the gospel, Jesus says this to the first disciples, except he says, "What are you looking for?" It's the very first thing that he says, right? And now he says, "Whom are you looking for?" And he says at the beginning, "Come and see." And now they have come and they're seeing it, and it's going to continue on from here. Now, notice, "I am not to drink the cup that the Father has given me." This appears in some of the other Gospels, right? Where Jesus says, he says it a little differently. He says, "Take this cup from me, if it's possible, but not my will, but yours be done." Here he says, "Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me?" So the soldiers, their officer, and the Jewish police arrested Jesus and bound him. First, they took him to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest, that year. And Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jews that it was better to have one person die for the people. And so then we hear the story about Simon Peter outside in the garden, outside in the courtyard, rather, of the high priest's house. So what would have happened in terms of this then? They bind Jesus, they bring him back into the city. The house of Caiaphas and Herod's palace and all the rich people are in what's called the upper city of Jerusalem. And they would have gone there. Pilate probably would have been in the city, because the reason he's there is because he would have come back into the city for Passover, because it was a volatile time. There could often be revolts of various kinds, because Passover is all about liberation, right? So Pilate would have come into the city from his normal residence at the beach in Caesarea Maritima, or Caesarea by the sea. Think about, Santa Barbara coming into LA. And he would have been in LA for the Passover.
Do you have any idea how far that was away?
In terms of just the walking distance or whatever. Yeah, I'm not sure offhand. You could do it. I've walked it in probably an hour or so.
I remember at one of our previous studies, there was a lecturer who showed us the temple, not the temple, the palace, and how it, like completely overlooked the city and the temple, so you could see if anybody was stirring up any trouble.
Oh, there's two different buildings. There is Herod's palace, which was in the residential quarter of the upper city, and there is the Antonia fortress that literally overlooks or overlooked in those days the Temple Mount, so that soldiers in that garrison could see what was going on, especially on the Temple Mount. And in fact, at different times they caused problems, because they sometimes, like, well, anyways, that's a whole other story. But soldiers would ridicule Jewish people going to the temple from their fortress as a way to mock them. And sometimes there was actually like military maneuvers, like if there was a riot, they would shoot arrows from there down onto people. But yeah, that's the Antonia fortress. That would have been beneath Pilate's dignity to stay there. It was mostly a barracks with a military tower on top of it. Pilate would have stayed in Herod's palace, where it's much more comfortable. Although people used to think that was where the trial of Jesus might have happened, or must have happened, because it was a Roman fortress. But what we do know now is that when Pilate and when governors and that would come to Jerusalem, they would stay in the better quarters of Herod's palace than Antonia fortress. So Peter denies Jesus, and he denies him how many times? 3 times. And at that moment, the cock crowed, right? 3 times is going to be really important as we get to the end of the gospel too, as we'll see. But then they come before Pilate. Then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters, and it was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement to be able to eat the Passover. So remember, this is the day of the preparation for the Passover. John's gospel, again, is different than the other 3 gospels, because the Last Supper does not happen on Passover. It happens on the day before Passover Eve, which is in John's gospel, because the day that Jesus is killed is the day when the lambs are offered as a sacrifice. And at the very hour that the lambs are being ritually sacrificed in the temple, Jesus is being executed on the cross. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered, "If this man were not a criminal, why would we have handed him over to you?" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." In other words, what are you disturbing me for? And then the Jews replied, "We're not allowed to put anyone to death." This was to fulfill what Jesus had said when he indicated the kind of death he was to die. In other words, crucifixion, right? That they can't put anybody to death, but So they need his authority to be able to do that.
Confused, not an expert on Jewish law, but I thought that if you were blasphemous or you said that you were God, you could be stoned, or even for adultery, if you happen to be female, you could be stoned. And wouldn't that be putting someone to death?
Well, you're right. And this brings us back to the pesky story in chapter 8. Which is, as I described it, as a story in search of a gospel of the woman who's caught in adultery. And as Suzanne pointed out, in the book of Deuteronomy, it is both the man and the woman who would be guilty of adultery, and would the penalty of which would be stoning to death. But in this case, only the woman is brought in to be stoned to death. But you're right, that's an interesting case. But it was the case that Jews were not allowed to execute someone according to their own law without the authority and permission of Rome. Now, how they got that, I don't know the answer to that all the time. It's a Roman law to keep order, right? So that they aren't the administrators of the means of violence, right? The ones who administer the means of violence are the imperial authorities. That's what's at issue here. Okay, so 33. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world, or my kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom belonged to this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" Great question. So Jesus' kingdom is not of this cosmos, right? So there's a conflict here between the cosmos as empire and the world as God created it, the cosmos as good. And so that his kingdom is not from this world system. It's not from this cosmos, this imperial mindset of Rome or any other empire. It is something different. And this is where the Matrix comes in. What? Snapping your heads. That this is what I love the movie The Matrix. Matrix Resurrections is okay. It's not on the plane. But Matrix itself is wonderful at getting at this very image that, hey, Kelsey, can you all hear me now? Yes, okay. So back to the Matrix, how appropriate. So in living in this false reality, you're giving an option. You can have I never get these right. Yeah. What's which? Okay, the red pill, if you get the red pill, you see the world the way it really is. If you have the blue pill, you can live in this false consciousness, this false reality. So this is kind of what's at work here. Jesus is saying, Pilate, you can have a red pill or a blue pill. You can see the world as you Romans are have fantasized about it, your imperial grandeur, or you can see the world the way it really is, that beneath all of your pretensions, there is a created order and a true cosmos that will outlast you, and you will eventually come to ruin. And so you can believe the truth that I'm telling you, or you can believe a fantasy. And so Pilate says, well, what is truth? Is it the fake world or this theoretically real world? And what is it? Right? What is truth? What is the real world? What is the real consciousness? And that is the question, right? So Pilate, representing all the authorities of the world, all the principalities and powers, confronts Jesus, and standing right before him is the one who is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. And he cannot recognize that for what it is, because for him, it is a beaten Jew. But behind all that is another reality that is the true reality. So after he had said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, I find no case against him. But you have the custom that I relieve someone for you at the Passover. Do you want me to release for you the King of the Jews? They shouted in reply, not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a rebel. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged, and the soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they dressed him in a purple robe. So he's having an enthronement ceremony here, right? It's again the sort of irony of the gospel. What they're saying is, we're mocking you by all this kingship, pretend kingship, but in reality, by giving him a crown and a purple robe, they are in fact investing him as the king. So that's the irony of what John is saying here.
My New Revised Standard Version says that Barabbas was a bandit, and to me, they're quite different. Well, one would be that Barabbas was a bandit, so what one would be more of a common criminal versus a rebel that would be some sort of virtuous freedom fighter of sorts, right?
Yes. Bandit, I think in this context, is more like the freedom fighter thing. It's more like a Robin Hood kind of character. More of a zealot, but violent, probably stealing from the rich to give the poor, maybe, that sort of thing. He was that kind of guy, right? But you're right. I mean, that the word in Greek is, if he was here to be crucified, which he probably would have been, he wouldn't have been a common thief. He would have been an insurrectionist of some sort. Not a common thief wouldn't be, no, it wouldn't be worth their while. Well, no, I mean, the point of crucifixion was primarily for slaves that ran away, or people who are threatening the security of the empire, those sorts of crimes, insurrection, that would be why you would be crucified primarily. So the logic here is anything that disrupts the equilibrium of the Pax Romana could be cause for crucifixion. You could kill people in a number of ways, right? If you needed to, and not just if you were a common thief didn't mean you were get killed. You were treated, you were punished in some way, but not necessarily killed. Yeah.
Gloria, did you want to speak? We can't hear you. Are you muted? We can't hear you.
In my version, it calls Barabbas an insurrectionist, which is a word that's being bandied about often these days. So it kind of clicked on me, oh, he was an insurrectionist. He was more than just a regular old bandit.
Thank you.
Oh, I have a question too. And hopefully you could clear this up for me. I always thought it said that he was a murderer or something, right?
He probably would have been up with murdering people because he's a revolutionary, right? Or an insurrectionist, or a rebel in some way, right? So he could very well have been a murderer, but it's a broader category than just your garden variety murderer. Susan has it.
Well, I'm wondering if we just have a King James version of the Bible here or something, because I just don't recall ever hearing about this revolutionary side. I thought he was either a thief or a murderer. But yeah, I was gonna look at one of my old Bibles when I get home. Okay. But I didn't realize they reserved crucifixion for more prominent, or how you want to say it.
Again, you wouldn't necessarily be crucified by just being a common thief, right? Yeah.
Got my curiosity really going here. Let's say that there were two Roman citizens, two guys, and they got in a fight over money, and one killed the other. How would they punish the guy?
They would never crucify him, because a Roman citizen would never be crucified. Roman citizens were never crucified. They would have beheaded him. The noble way for a Roman to die is either to give him the chance to take his own life, which is the preferable way, or chop his head off. One of the two choices. What's that?
Oh yeah, I was just saying for Roman citizens, but for the rabble, they could just hang them, right? It's cheap and easy. You can't. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, I don't know all of these particulars of Roman execution practices. Perhaps someone could look that up at some point and share it all with us, what the particulars would be. What I do know is that crucifixion was particularly used because it was public, and it was always at a public crossroads to say, this is what will happen to you if you defy Rome. That's so defying Rome for a non-Roman citizen was what crucifixion was all about. That's what they were up for with that, right? But we got very popular.
No, I was just thinking about the death of Socrates, because he took hemlock. Now that was Greek, but so the Romans adopted that from the Greek, that was an honorable way to go.
Right. I mean, if you would if you were a person, an honorable person, like someone of status in Roman society, you might very well be given the option to take your own life, or you would be told surreptitiously that tomorrow they're going to come by and you're probably going to get arrested because you have done whatever it is, this like really bad thing. Just telling you that, and so then at dinner, you just arrange it so that you take never wake up again pills or something, right? So that's an honorable way to go, for them.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Is it working? One thing that I've always been curious about is, Pilate says, you're a king, and Jesus says, my kingdom's not of this world. And Pilate asks him, what is the truth? And then he doesn't crucify him for saying that his kingdom is not of this world. Like, is there kind of an implication that, I guess my curiosity, like, why is what Jesus has said at this point not enough to crucify him? Not enough to crucify him.
I think because he doesn't see him necessarily as a threat to the Roman Empire, right? He sees him, he's saying, my kingdom is not of this world. It's sort of he's interpreting it maybe as a spiritual kingdom that really maybe not. And, the text seems to be implying that Pilate is waffling and maybe fearful himself, and because he doesn't know how to deal with the Jews, and he maybe doesn't want to crucify him, but he can't. He knows that there's a powerful political bloc that are trying to crucify him. By the way, this is why I think that we need to think of this as the Jewish leaders or the Judean leaders, not to use what John often says, quote unquote, scarecrows, the Jews. The people who would have been around here in the upper city would have been elites. The lower city is where the average common folks lived. So the people who would have been doing all of this would have probably been elite people that were trying to do him in. So we have to also, again, be really careful when we think of the Jews is not an ethnic designation here or a religious designation per se. It is a socio-political religious block of people. That's why in Greek it's Eudonai, the Judeans. It literally means the Judeans. What's often translated as the Jews is literally the Judeans. So I think it gives that sense of more of a sense of the political religious elites that had something to gain and lose by insurrection against Rome. Caiaphas says that a couple of chapters ago when he says it's better for one man to die for the people so that the boat doesn't get rocked.
So when you see this dramatized, like in the movies, and there's a bunch of guys in, men and women wearing these, kind of day-to-day, work-a-day clothes almost made of burlap. But in reality, it should be, a bunch of men wearing, beautiful robes and everything like that.
Probably would have been just men, right? And they aren't, and probably from the elite priestly classes, the Sadducees, maybe some of the Pharisees. The Sadducees were the most elite class, and that they are very much concerned that there's not going to be anything that's going to destroy their privilege and their way of life. That's really important to them, obviously, right? And in all fairness, and disrupt the whole apple cart of this very tenuous balance they have with the Roman Empire for everybody.
That particular class of people is really interesting to me because in order for them to have acquired wealth and status while their ethnic group was largely oppressed, wouldn't that have meant that they had to kind of cater to the Romans and make deals with them and kind of it really kind of speaks to the the lessons that Jesus is sharing in previous chapters about not trying to find security in this world at the expense of others. Like these people are kind of examples of those who have kind of sold their souls for a sense of security and safety and financial wealth, right?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't have time to go into the whole development over time of the Hasmonean dynasty, which was the last independent kingship in Israel or Judea before the Romans came in. But there was a whole elite class already that the Romans simply just sort of like grafted onto, right? And the Sadducees, which were the priestly class, were the ones charged with the temple, where the high priest would have come from, et cetera, et cetera. The Pharisees were a totally different. Oftentimes, the Pharisees were poor folks. They weren't necessarily wealthy folks. Many of them were, but they weren't necessarily that, right? They came from various strata of society. But the Sadducees, generally speaking, the priestly class were pretty much all the elite class. Anyway, moving on from here. So this, the Judean leaders here take a tactical turn. Verse 12, Pilate tried to release him, but the Jews cried out, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who claims to be a king sets himself against Caesar." When Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus outside and sat on the judge's bench at a place called the Stone Pavement, or in Hebrew, Gabbatha, which is interesting here because in Greek, and sat on the judge's bench, it's unclear who the sitter is. Was it Pilate, or is it Jesus who sat on the judge's bench? Jesus dressed in the royal clothes, sitting on the bench of the judge. Another Johannine irony. But so it could be either in the way John writes it here. Now, it was the day of preparation for the Passover. He wants us to know that again, right? He wants to underline that. And it was about noon, which is the time when the Jews the temple sacrifice would have begun. "Here is your king." And they cried out, away with him, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate asked them, "Shall I crucify your king?" And then the chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." Then he handed him over to them to be crucified. Isn't that interesting that earlier on they say, "We are not slaves." In an earlier chapter, "We have Abraham for our father, and God is our king." But here, when it's convenient for them, they say, "Oh, now, Pilate, don't you realize that we are true loyalists to the emperor, aren't you?" And so he really has no choice at this point, because publicly he would be humiliated to do that, and word might get back to Rome. And even if he, he's certainly no friend of Jesus. But I think what John is trying to tell us here is that it's the whole humanity that is doing this, not just the Judeans, not just the Romans, but humanity who is putting him to death.
Well, Pilate, he doesn't really take responsibility. He's supposed to be in charge, and he doesn't take any responsibility. He's passing the buck. And yet I noticed that, well, not always in this church, but most churches, every single week, we always say, "Suffered under Pontius Pilate."
That's true. He did suffer under Pontius Pilate. If he could have taken charge, right? Had he wanted to, you're right. That's the creed, right? And in fact, the building over, we don't see this often, but over the arch of our church is the phrase from the creed in Latin. "He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, suffered, died, and was buried." And it ends there. Now, why did they do that? I often was wondering about that. But then when we did that on a tour once, we came inside the church and the doors open, and what do you see? The triptych. That's the rest of the story. Out. No, Siri. So yeah, so outside in the world, all that we see is that, right? I think. Oh, Felicia, okay, sorry.
When you were talking about the Pharisees saying we have no king but Caesar, it's interesting because that goes back to Genesis, I think, Genesis or Exodus, when they asked God for a king. The people of Israel asked God for a king, and God tells them, you really don't want that. And they said, yes, we do. And then God tells the prophet, okay, give them what they want. And they've suffered for it ever since. To ask for that kind of dominion from anything other than God, who is perfection, is like a recipe for disaster. But they sure claimed him that day.
So then Pilate brings him forth, and he says the famous line, "Behold the man," ecce homo in Latin. And in Greek, the word is anthropos, that is basically the human being. So he suffers as the human being in John's gospel. Then they took Jesus, and carrying his cross by himself, he went out to what is called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is called Golgotha. And there they crucified him with two others, one on either side, with Jesus between them. And Pilate also had an inscription written and put on the cross. It said, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." And in fact, that the word in Greek is a strange word. It's techelos, which is just sort of a Greekified Latin word for the thing that sometimes was put on the head of a cross, a titulus, which was sort of, what is the crime that this person is being accused of? And Pilate says, for being the King of the Jews. Not. That's why the religious authorities say, do not write the King of the Jews, but this man said, I am the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, what I have written, I have written. So he says, what is your crime? He is the King of the Jews. When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they took his clothes and divided them into 4 parts, one for each soldier. And they also took his tunic. Now the tunic was seamless, woven in one piece from the top. So they said to one another, let us not tear it, but cast lots for it to see who gets it. This was to fulfill what the scripture says. They divided my clothes among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. And that is what the soldiers did. Meanwhile, standing near the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. And when Jesus saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing beside her, he said to his mother, woman, here is your son. Then he said to the disciple, here is your mother. And from that hour, the disciple took her into his home. Even at the cross here, the little community, the little family of the beloved of Jesus is being formed. Jesus is making that little family happen. That bonds of flesh and blood and bonds of his blood are what make the beloved community, what makes the little family, the little flock, as we heard today, for Jesus. And after this, when Jesus knew that all was now finished, he said, in order to fulfill the scripture, I am thirsty. And a jar full of sour wine was standing there. So they put a sponge full of the wine on a branch of hyssop and held it to his mouth. And when Jesus had received the wine, he said, it is finished, tetelestai. In other words, it is fully accomplished. Everything that I came to do is done. And then he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. As he gives up his last. So the just like at the beginning of creation, This is a new creation that happens in his death. A new life and a new world begins. And since it was the day, this is the cool part, since the day was preparation, the Jews did not want the bodies left on the cross during the Sabbath, and especially for the Passover, and especially because that Sabbath was a day of great solemnity. So they asked Pilate to have the legs of the crucified men broken and the bodies removed. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and the other who had been crucified with him. But when they came to Jesus and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. He who saw this has testified so that you may also believe. His testimony is true, and he knows that he tells the truth so that you also may come to believe. These things occurred so that the scripture might be fulfilled. None of his bones shall be broken. This is like the Passover lamb. None of the bones are broken of the Passover lamb. Jesus is the Passover lamb, killed at the same time that the lambs are killed in the temple. John wants us to get that loud and clear. He says it again and again and again in various ways. And again, another passage of scripture which says they will look on the one whom they have pierced. They pierced his side with a spear, and at once blood and water came out. This is the water that he promises that will gush out from him into the water of life. It's the blood of the Eucharist also that he talks about in chapter 6, abundantly coming forth. But also, Jesus is the mother of the new creation. And he's giving birth, blood and water coming forth from him as he gives the new creation. He is like the mother giving birth to a baby, which is the new creation. So this, if you want to have an image of Jesus as mother, here's one for you. After these things, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, though a secret one for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate to let him take away the body of Jesus. Now he's no longer a secret one because he's just gone to Pilate and says he wants the body of Jesus. So he's sort of come out as a Jesus follower. Pilate gave him permission, so he came and removed his body. Nicodemus, who had first come to Jesus by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes, weighing about 100 pounds. That's a huge, insane amount of very expensive burial spices. And they took the body of Jesus and wrapped it with the spices in linen cloths, according to the burial custom of the Jews. And now there was a garden, another garden, in the place where he was crucified. And in the garden, there was a new tomb in which no one had ever been laid. And so because it was the Jewish day of preparation and the tomb was nearby, they laid Jesus there. So we have Nicodemus, that one who comes by night, and the last thing he says to Jesus is, how can these things be? And yet he shows up here at the very end and gives us abundant gift, not unlike the woman, Martha, or Mary rather, in chapter 11, who pours an expensive amount of nard on the feet of Jesus. Here Nicodemus does the same thing. We aren't told specifically that he becomes an actual Jesus follower, but one can believe that he does, right? Because he does this act for him in his death. And so Jesus is buried in another garden. And that is where this week's story ends. Anything else for the good of the order that we want to think about on this last part of the passage?
Thinking about Pilate again. So he has them write King of the Jews, and says, basically I said what I said, and then he gives Nicodemus and what was his name, the other one, Jesus's body. So there's almost kind of this like slight implication that he is on their side. Is that intentional? This kind of, you talked a little bit about him being wishy-washy. Is there, like, the way that John has characterized him, kind of what is the thought on that?
I guess it's not clear, right? I mean, what, if, is it just sort of like, well, sure, we're not leaving the bodies on the cross anyway. So if you want it, go ahead. There's that, or maybe there's more to it than that. In certain Orthodox traditions, there's a story that he became a Christian, ultimately. But that's not in the Church in the West hasn't had that particular tradition, but in certain Orthodox traditions, he is understood to have become a Christian. But we don't know the answer to that question. But it certainly is a sense of diffidence still, right? That comes out clearly throughout the passage.
I've often heard that Pilate was so brutal historically that he eventually was removed from his rule by the Romans.
Yeah, I believe that's true. You hear that even in the Gospels, there's a reference to his putting down an insurrection, and he apparently, according to the Bible story, he mingled their blood with the blood of their sacrifices. And yeah, I mean that he didn't stay long as governor of Judea. He was sent back to Rome, I believe, did something else. I mean, we are able to know what happened to some of these folks by looking at some of the records. I'm not sure exactly what happened to him after that. We know that we are quite sure that he existed historically because there's an inscription in Caesarea Maritima that he gave. I think it's an amphitheater. So we have his name there. So we know that he was actually a historical character and we have that verified through outside sources. But we don't really know what much happened after that, right? So he's lost sort of in the mists of history, except the fact that I don't know who the next Roman governor was, but it wasn't, there was somebody who replaced him, and I believe it was not long after this, probably. Yeah.
What was the significance of hyssop when they gave him the spoiled wine?
Yeah, I mean, under the rubric of John lets no good detail go unremarked, could very well be that remember in the book of Exodus, hyssop was used to sprinkle the people with blood. So it could be a reference back to that, but or it could just be, a desire to have verisimilitude. That it wasn't just like branch; it was a hyssop branch. In the same way, the slave's name was Malchus. It was a particular slave. It wasn't just anybody. It was, and that guy's name was Malchus. So, the question.
I was always taught that it says INRI on the top of the cross. What does that mean? Or
that is a abbreviation of the titulus of the cross, the title that goes on the cross. It's the Latin version. The inscription is in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek, right? And in Latin, it's Jesus Nazarenus Rex Iudiorum, INRI. Jesus, and which would be starting with Jesus, okay? Nazarenus, Jesus of Nazareth, Rex, King, Iudiorum, of the Jews. So that's what it refers to. It's the initials of what would have been on the title of the cross, about what he was accused of as being the King of the Jews. And then it would obviously be different in Greek, and it would be different in Hebrew. So that's where we get that little inscription on the cross. So next week, we go to chapter 20 and 21, where things are a little bit different. But the last thing I wanted to leave us with is to get this sense of, Jesus breathes on the disciples in the resurrection, but he also breathes out his last. So by the giving up of his life, he's breathing out his spirit and recreating the world and bringing forth the beginning of a new creation. Blood and water flow forth from his side. He's giving birth to something new through his death, new life is going to emerge. If a grain of wheat does not fall to the ground and die, it remains only a grain. But if it falls to the ground, it produces much fruit. So this is all the imagery that's going on here at this very end of the story. All right. Thanks, folks. See you next week. Thanks, Gloria. Thanks, Jenny, for being with us, and anybody who is with us incognito on the other side.
That would be Earl.